Hey, my name is Lauren. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening. I just want to start by reminding everyone that the museum is open until 8 p.m. on Thursdays. So after tonight's talk, please feel free to spend some time in the exhibit halls and see the exhibits if you haven't had a chance to do that previously. And if you ever want to come back on a future Thursday evening, we're always open until 8. So tonight, I am delighted to welcome all of you to a discussion of climate change, dynamic landscapes, and evolution. Moderating tonight's panel is Dr. Edward Davis, the museum's Director of Paleontological Collections and an Associate Professor of Earth Sciences here at the University of Oregon. Our panelists include, starting on this end of the table, Dr. Catherine Batchley, a Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Michigan. Her general research interest is the history of biological diversity, especially from the perspective of ancient and modern mammals. Much of her recent research focuses on the ecology and evolution of mammalian faunas in response to climate. Next, we have Dr. Dana Reuter, a recent UO PhD and a current NSF postdoctoral research fellow in biology. Dana is a paleoecologist who studies the processes that govern ecological diversity and community structure change. Her research focuses on the ecological links among extinct animals and their environment. Third down the table is Dr. Rebecca Terry, an associate professor of integrative biology at Oregon State University. Rebecca is interested in the temporal and spatial responses of small land mammal communities to changes in climate and anthropogenic land use over modern, historical, and paleontological timescales. And last but certainly not least is Dr. Maya Stokes, an assistant professor in the Department of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Florida State University. And as a Gator at the University of Florida, I will not hold that against her this evening. Her research focuses on the intersection of geology and biology to understand how topography changes over time and how that might affect the evolution of life. Please join me in welcoming our moderator and our panelists.
Hey everybody, and I'm going to forego doing a little introductory slideshow this time. I think a lot of folks were here for the first one, and we're going to actually hear some more about the background to the project from our panelists today. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Badgley, and she can take it away with her presentation. We're going to have short presentations from each panelist, and then we'll answer some questions and answers.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you again, all of you, for coming out tonight. It's great to see you. I'm going to talk a little bit about my areas of interest, which are climate change, dynamic landscapes, and mammal evolution in particular. And this scene here, which is from the Great Basin in Nevada, is a reminder of the complex landscapes that we have in Western North America. And of course, you folks are very lucky to be living right in the middle of some of them. And what has motivated my interest over the last 10 years or so is how mountain building affects the diversity of mammals. And because that's, we see some very striking patterns today, which I'll show you in just a moment. But because these processes play out over millions of years, it's very important to look at what the fossil record has to tell us about that. And that's what I'll talk about. So if one looks at all of North America in this digital elevation model here, and then we map the species richness of modern mammals on here, we see that for any, say, 100 by 100 square mile unit of area over here, that there's there are many more species of mammals in the areas of complex topography, which look all very wrinkly here, compared to all these flat, smooth lowlands in the east, and including even these very ancient mountain ranges. And so I'm very interested in the history of this pattern. And this turns out to be a pattern that affects not only mammals, but other terrestrial vertebrates. And what we've discovered in this pattern is what we call the topographic richness gradient, which is a gradient in species richness that tracks elevation, topographic complexity, relief, and other properties that people who study mountains use. So here are some data showing, the extent of this pattern from a paper published a few years ago. Here we're looking at the land area of the world that comprises mountains compared to the land that's lowlands, and you see that the mountains comprise a much smaller proportion of the land area. And here we're looking for mammals, for birds and amphibian species of the world. We're seeing the fraction of species that live either exclusively at high elevation or at high and low elevations compared to lowlands alone. And we see that the bulk of the species are for all three groups are living at these higher elevations. So these are part of the data that confirm this pattern, not just for mammals, but for others. But mammals have an excellent fossil record, and that's one reason that we're focusing on them. So we want to ask what processes are contributing to this pattern, and what processes might we be inquiring about as we study the past. And I just want to list some of the ones we need to think about. One is the formation of new species in fragmented geographic ranges, which we see in spades in mountainous regions. Certainly adaptation to these very strong elevational gradients it could promote what we call ecological speciation mechanisms. We also see elevational range shifts during climate change, which when they happen repeatedly can bring new species into a region. We also see extinction of small isolated populations. So not only do we have new species arising, but we also have species disappearing in these areas. And finally, we have immigration through dispersal where habitat connectivity permits, and very long mountain ranges like the Rockies and the Andes have examples of this. And I'll come back to that right at the end. So as I mentioned, I'm studying the fossil record where we can hope to see some of the changes in mammal diversity as the landscape is changing in its properties. And this is the glimpse of the Barstow Formation in the Mojave Desert. And this is one of the fossil records that I've studied to look at some of the data that reinforce the patterns. And it turns out that the fossil record for mammals is quite good. All these little blue dots are showing us fossil records where we found, in fact, fossil rodents, which are often recovered through screen washing. And there are hundreds of localities, and these colors represent different geological regions of the lower 48 states. And we were collaborating with geologists who are reconstructing the mountainous history of Western North America. And this is a little snapshot from one of their recent reconstructions at 16 million years ago. And what's interesting about that time period is we're in the middle of a global warming episode during them called the Miocene climatic optimum. And in addition, we have very rapid tectonic movements across the Basement Range. This is when the state of Nevada was being transformed from a skinny little north-south state to the wide state that it is today through the geological process of extension. And one enormous mountain range, represented in white here, was being pulled apart into the hundreds of parallel ranges that we call the Basement Range today. And so this was a time when essentially all hell was breaking loose on the land. And so what we find, interestingly, is that if we look at the record of mammal diversity, that during this period of the Miocene climatic optimum and this very rapid rate of change in the landscape, that we see a pulse in mammal diversity that maps on exactly the most rapid rate of area change across this the Basement Range over the last 30 million years. So that's suggesting to us that this huge increase in mammal diversity that we see then was a response to the rate of landscape change. So when the landscape was changing at its most rapid, that's when we're seeing this huge spike in mammal diversity. But it also coincides with a period of global warming. So we're still trying to discern how much of this spike is a response to the landscape history and how much is a response to climate change, which is a really interesting question. Finally, I want to say that all of this research, even though I'm looking in the deep past, also has relevance for conservation today. And this figure is from a study by a collaborator of ours, Jenny McGuire, who was looking at the possibility of through topographic complexity, that there's climate connectivity between a place that a species lives today and where its preferred climate might be in 100 years. And the blue areas here represent areas where species have highest probability of success of tracking their preferred climates as global warming happens. And what we see, which is really encouraging, is that it's the mountainous regions of Western North America that have the greatest probabilities of success. And so that means that the many unique species that live in mountain ranges do actually have a reasonable probability of tracking preferred climates according to this particular analysis. And finally, I'll just end by saying I'm very fortunate to be part of a research collaboration network with most of the panelists here and others that you heard if you came to the previous panel, because these are big problems that we're trying to tackle. And it's really fun to be tackling them with people who have very different kinds of expertise. And so I'm delighted to be part of this group that we have our acronym, it's called NARLI, North American Rodents, Landscapes, Evolution and Ecology. Thank you, and let me pass on to Dana.
Okay, hello. That was a great intro and it set me up nicely actually for some of the things I'm also going to talk about. So I am a paleoecologist and I'm really interested in how the environment is influencing diversity and also community structure. So not just how many species are on the landscape, but what are those species doing and how they're interacting. And the thing that I really like to think about, and this is kind of a complicated scheme of my like research pipeline, is I like to get field data. So I go out and collect fossils. I also work in museums like the one here. And then I also rely on previously published data sets to understand how different traits that animals have are related to one another. And I'm really interested in diet. And so how the diet of an organism is related to where it lives, how big it is, the shape of its body, and also who it's related to and how that changes over time. And the hope is that by understanding these relationships between these traits, I can start to understand if there's any predictive rules we can make about where animals live and how they change their time. And that can be applied to many different scales. So through time and also across space and in communities and on species. And so one of the things that I really want you to think about from my research is that the environment kind of dictates what's available for you to eat. So if you imagine a really hot and humid environment, we'll have a different set of plants than say a really dry and cool environment or a very warm and dry environment. And so it can really play a role in the diversity of animals that are there, the community composition. So what you find on the landscape, the food web structures, so how the organisms are interacting, and also the abundance of animals. So if there's a lot of them or just a few. And so some really good questions that paleontologists that think about this really focus on is how did past climate change influence communities? And then what does that past climate change and community change say about our future? Can we use that to understand where we're going next? And so I, for my dissertation work here at the University of Oregon, mostly focused on the time slices that we have here in the fossil record, because we have such a great record in Oregon of this climate change. So we have fossils that are found 30 million years ago, all the way up to about 5 million years ago. And this really captures that warming trend that she talked about earlier, around 16 million years ago, and then it cools back off again. So that's what this red line is representing, is kind of global temperatures through time. And so what I did is I relied on a lot of the museum specimens we have in this lovely museum. And also we went out and we collected some more at certain sites that are really important. And I took a lot of morphological measurements and also did a lot of isotopic work to understand what organisms we're eating. And just to give you a little flavor of the results. So these are some isotopic records from a bunch of herbivores. And one of the great things that you can do with carbon isotopes in their teeth is kind of understand if they're living in a more closed or a more open landscape. And so the organisms that are more towards the bottom are more living in a forest versus the ones that have a higher value are living in a more open landscape or grassland. And what we found when we combine this data with the morphological data is I started to make food webs for these fossil localities and comparing the food webs so that we can understand the relationship between organisms. And we found that there is differences between the communities. We kind of have one set of communities early on, and then when we have the warming trend, we have a different set of communities. And then finally, we have the modern communities that we have today. And just a little two taxa that are very interesting that disappeared from the food webs after the Pleistocene. are the peccaries. So they were there for about 20 million years and then they disappear from the food webs, and it really does make a difference in the structure. And then the second one is the large proboscideans. So, you know, mastodons, mammoths, like the ones we have in the front of the museum, they disappear as well. And they're kind of this large herbivore that we don't have anymore. And it really changed the structure of the food web. To further just kind of put this on the timeline, we go from really well connected food webs that have lots of omnivores and small browsers. And then when things start warming up and getting really wet, we end up with a less connected food web because we actually have so many herbivores. There's a lot of them. They're doing a lot of the same things, so it actually brings the connections down a little bit. And then when things start cooling off and they start transitioning into a grassland, we actually lose a lot of those browsers and omnivores, and we get a more homogeneous herbivore community. Because if you imagine if there's mostly just grass around to eat, most of you will be eating the grass. So this really changed the structure of the food webs for what we have today. And so just to go back to kind of my mind map of how this all works is that kind of look at these patterns of change and trying to understand if we can make some sort of inferences from these past changes for what's going to happen in the future. Okay.
Sure, I hit the right buttons here. There we go. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Rebecca Terry, and like Edward said, I'm from just up the road at Oregon State University. And I am part of this gnarly working group, and I have been since the beginning. It's been really, really fun. I am a modern and paleoecologist with a specialty thinking about what the world has looked like and how it's changed since the last ice age. In my lab, since we're right down the street, I'll tell you what we do. We're very interested in questions about how and why biodiversity has changed in response to past episodes of environmental change. How and why biodiversity is arrayed today, spatially the way it is. So what are the historical processes that have given rise to the distribution of diversity today? And what attributes make species more or less likely to persist in the face of environmental change? Those are the questions that motivate us and that we spend a lot of time thinking about. As you can probably tell from all these pictures, I also spend a lot of time thinking about small mammals, and I like them for a number of reasons. They provide a really great study system to integrate across different time scales. So I work a lot with quaternary fossil records, like the ones that come out of caves that we have here in Oregon. But I also work with modern dead remains, what I like to call death assemblages, which are skeletal remains that are on their way to becoming fossils. Maybe not, but they're on the landscape today. And I combine those with what I like to call live data, which are data that come from trapping surveys or from biodiversity inventories. And those can be both modern and historical. So I work a lot with historical museum collections, collected by trappers 100 years ago, as well as do my own modern inventories as well. And it's really important to point out that not all dead data are old, they're not all fossil, and not all live data are modern. They can be actually quite old. And so it's that zone of the interface between those, the zone of overlap, shall we say, that is where I spend most of my time focusing my research. And so why small mammals? Well, as we've heard, they're very diverse, and they're also very climate and habitat sensitive. They have very small range sizes and fast generation times, so they give you a really fine scale picture of what was happening at a place at a given time, much more so than a migrating mammoth that's wandering across the entire continent, for example. Not that mammoths aren't cool, they are cool too. They're also ecologically extremely important because they connect primary producers with higher trophic levels in a food web. And so they have this really important role to play when it comes to transferring energy through terrestrial food webs. And as Catherine pointed out, they show this striking pattern where diversity is highest in mountainous regions. And so you can see that here, the areas that light up here as high in terms of species richness cluster in the western half of North America and are arrayed along the north-south trending mountain ranges. So the fossil sites that I have worked at tend to be arrayed across the northern Great Basin. I've put a little beaver head in here, so you can see my Corvallis and I paint that, but I never want time. So it's almost Eugene right there. And I'll point out that I've been working at 2 sites that are actually, that are archaeological sites that are actively being researched and excavated here by University of Oregon archaeologists. So the Paisley Cave, which you can learn about actually right here in the museum. I'm working on the small mammal record from that site, doing a faunal analysis. And then this summer, I'm going to start working on the record from Connolly Caves as well. And then in terms of, what I have done in terms of modern and historical mammal work, I have spent a lot of time at this point running around in different mountains across the Great Basin doing historical resurveys. So we're working from trapping records, field notes, specimens that were collected about 100 years ago by E. Raymond Hall's students and Joseph Grinnell's students. And we're going back to the same sites and using the same techniques and resurveying those communities so we can see how they have changed since the 1920s or the 1930s. And so all of these little green blobs here, these are all the mountain ranges that we have been resurveying, that we have completed or are currently underway. And the little yellow dots are just other tracking sites that are actually on the mountains. There it goes. So with respect to, why am I on this panel? Well, so I've had the pleasure of working with Catherine and the Gnarly group now for, gosh, like four or 5 years. I don't know, since before its inception. And Catherine is too modest. She's the leader of this group. And she has corralled a whole bunch of us and focused us in on these fascinating questions. And so one of the things that I've been working on as part of this group is actually zooming in a much smaller scale to individual mountain ranges within the Great Basin and looking at the distribution of diversity along the elevational gradients that those mountain ranges represent. And the question that we've been asking in collaboration with geomorphologists is whether or not there's a role for that surface geomorphology in shaping the diversity that we see today across elevation within a single mountain range and across mountain ranges. And my collaborators, also from the Gnarly group on this, my direct collaborators are Rebecca Rowe, who's a mammologist at the University of New Hampshire, and Brian Yanitis, who's a geomorphologist, who I think you heard from last month, who was out here for this panel as well. So what have we been doing? Well, so interestingly, there is this pattern that is very common that shows up across all different taxonomic groups, lots of different mountains around the world, where as you go up in elevation, you're going to encounter the highest species richness midway up the mountain at mid elevation. It's called the mid elevation peak in diversity. So it's a very common pattern that's found a lot of places, but there's no good consensus on what the underlying process is that's driving that pattern. Now, spoiler alert, I'm not going to answer that for you today, but it's something that's very interesting. There's been all sorts of different hypotheses proposed, ranging from is it just a geometric constraint of working in a bounded domain, or does it have to do with climate, precipitation, habitat heterogeneity? But what we noticed is that one of the things that's been missing from a lot of discussion about mid-elevation diversity piece is that there's never been any role for geology that's been brought into that discussion. And so we've been really interested in looking through a new lens, which is the lens of geomorphology and the processes that are shaping mountains on the landscape. Primary among them, of course, are rivers. So fluvial processes, they exert a very strong influence on topography. They transport sediment, they redeposit it elsewhere. And so they're really shaping the distribution of area in these mountainous regions. And that in turn can then shape the distribution of diversity in those mountains. So we set out to actually test these hypotheses in a real life landscape of the Ruby Mountains in Nevada. This is Lamoille Canyon. It's gorgeous. If you've never been there, it's like the Yosemite of Nevada. It is spectacularly beautiful. And it's an elevation gradient that spans almost 1,400 meters and captures these continuous transitions in habitat all the way from desert scrub in the lowland all the way up to above tree line at the top. And it was trapped extensively in the mid 1920s. So we have a really strong historical trapping record from this area as well. So we resurveyed all up this gradient as well as a bunch of other sites in 2006, 2007, 2008, and 2013. And sure enough, there's a very strong mid-elevation peak in species richness up this canyon, both historically and today. These are the modern data from our own trapping surveys. And so the question we were asking is, well, what geomorphological factors might be important here? And so our geomorphologist, Brian, went in and started quantifying various aspects of the landscape, working from digital elevation models. This is now looking straight down on top of the canyon. Here's the headwater, and here we go all the way out to the valley floor. And those white circles, those are our trapping sites. And so within each of those localities, he quantified topographic relief, roughness, hypsometry. These are ways of describing the landscape's geomorphology. And we then put them into a model framework, a model selection framework, which we will not bore you with, but we were comparing how good a job do they do at predicting species diversity compared to the more traditional environmental variables that are often invoked to explain that mid-elevation peak in diversity. And that's what these green things are. So temperature, precipitation, primary productivity, habitat heterogeneity. And lo and behold, what shakes out of this model is that topographic relief and hypsometry, which is like the distribution of area across a landscape, show up as really important, as important, if not more important than many of those traditional variables. And again, we think this is because those surface processes are causing this non-random distribution of area within a single mountain. And then that translates as you grow in scale, that's going to translate out to more and more mountains. So yeah, it's a really interesting project. And so, in summary, I think geomorphological properties are really important, and we should start considering them in our studies of biodiversity. Everyone on this panel is going to argue that greater integration is needed, right? So, yeah, I'm talking to the choir here. But in terms of where we're going next with this, we're actually expanding out to other mountain ranges because it'd be really interesting to find out whether or not there's a legacy of different glacial histories on the distribution of diversity across the Great Basin. Some mountain ranges were glaciated, some were not at the height of the last glacial maximum. So we're expanding out to other mountain ranges that have different glacial histories. And I don't have an answer for you, but maybe in a year's time, I'll have more to say about that. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Maya.
All right, hello, everybody. Thank you all for being here. So my work is the most different, I think, from everybody else here. So I'm a geomorphologist, but I also study freshwater fishes, and particularly in the Southeast United States. So I want to zoom out really quickly and look at some global patterns of biodiversity. So here we're looking at a map of the number of bird, amphibian, and mammal species. And we've been looking at these kinds of maps for North America and mammals, right? But you can see across the world, those topography and species are not distributed uniformly. So there's more species near the equator, but also some of these mountains are really biodiverse. So I'll show the same map. This is from one of Catherine's papers where we see that mammal diversity is highest on the western margin, and this is the tectonically active region of the continent where the crust is deforming in response to the motion of tectonic plates. But if we look at the species diversity and drainage basins across the continental United States for freshwater fish, what you find is that the pattern is reversed, and we have our greatest fish species richness over here on the eastern part of the continent, particularly in the Mississippi River Basin. And this is the tectonically inactive part of our continent. It's not experiencing significant crustal deformation because of the motion of modern tectonic plates. I wanted to understand if these kind of patterns, the difference in mammals and fish were observed on a global scale. And so we categorize the world's mountains as tectonically active, inactive, or not a mountain, so a lowland. And so, we have our Andes and our Himalaya as our classic examples of convergent margins. So the Andes, we have an oceanic plate subducting underneath the continent. And then in the Himalaya, we have two continents colliding and creating the impressive mountain range we see there. And tectonically inactive mountain ranges include the Appalachians, or here the Great Escarpment of South Africa. And these are places with significant topography, but again, that are not experiencing current active deformation associated with tectonics. So we categorize the number of endemic species per unit area. So if you were to land a plane in any one spot and look for as many endemic species as you could in your surrounding area, for mammals, you would find you get your biggest bang for your buck here in the tectonically active mountain ranges. But for freshwater fishes, that pattern is reversed, where your tectonically inactive mountain ranges have the most endemic species per unit area. The next is the lowlands, and then our tectonically active mountain ranges. And freshwater fish are a very diverse vertebrate group. There's about 18,000 total species. So they're important to study. Mammals are cool too. But just to pitch that idea further, freshwater environments cover about 1% of the Earth's surface, but they host approximately 30% of described vertebrate species. And freshwater environments are very sensitive to environmental change. And so they're important places to work. I mostly work in the southeastern United States, which is a freshwater biodiversity hotspot. I just wanted to show you some beautiful pictures of the fishes of the southeastern United States. I know there's a lot of focus on salmonids over in the West Coast, and so there's cool fishes over on our coast too. And you can see that, you know, they have some amazing colors. So these are mostly minnows and darters, and those are the groups that I work on. Here's just some pictures of us in the field. Wanted to show you what the work looked like. And I wanted to show you just one example of the connection between geology and freshwater habitat. So this group here, this is the warrior darter. This is a geologic map of where it's found in northern Alabama. The white points are the only place where this species is found. And it's found almost exclusively on rivers that have their headwaters in carbonate rocks. So these are some pictures of what these spring-fed rivers in northern Alabama look like. It's a really beautiful place, and I can understand why these fish like these streams. So we're finding that there's a tight correlation between geology and freshwater habitat. And we think that might contribute to some of the species diversity we observe in this region, but also it's a good way to think about conservation priorities as well. So my lab, I just started it this year, but we try to understand what the mechanisms are that generated the astounding freshwater biodiversity of the southeastern United States and how can we best protect it. So thank you.
Let's thank the panel. I've learned a lot. I have to admit just now, especially about the fish. That's brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. So what I wanted to do is I have 2 or 3 questions I'm going to ask, have the panelists answer them, and then depending on how much time is left, I'll open the floor to questions from the audience. Okay. So the first question I wanted to ask is, do tectonic pulses and climate change work in synergy or opposition to their influences on diversification? So does tectonic change and climate work together? Do they work against one another in the way they're influencing diversification? I think we talked about this before. Maya was going to start off on this one.
Okay, so I think one thing to think about when you think about climate and tectonics is that it's really challenging to disentangle the two of them. And that's, as a geomorphologist, I think that's for a few reasons. So first, if you think about like a rain shadow, the presence of topography has a local effect, and could even have more than a local effect on climate. But the effect can go in the opposite way too, where climate can actually influence topography. And some people think that it could go as far as influence, mountain building. And so there are connections both on a local to global scale between tectonics, topography, and climate. And so even from a landscape scale, I think it's really challenging to disentangle the two. But I think the rest of the panelists can talk more about doing that from the fossil record and the impact on diversification.
And getting back to the question that Edward posed, at least from the standpoint of the mammal record of North America, we would say that the tectonics and climate are acting in synergy because when we're seeing those huge spikes in diversity, those are happening when we have both very active tectonic changes, but also during periods of global warming. So the way we've tried to explain that, since we can't easily pull it apart, is that we're seeing that mammals are having a very dramatic response to global warming when that is happening, but especially in areas of very complex topography. So the fossil record seems to be telling us that these are acting in synergy rather than in opposition.
Thanks, thank you. The rest of you want to weigh in? No, okay. Okay, Dan,
I can talk a little bit about like here in Oregon, I know that something that happened and we're trying to also disentangle from the fossil record is we have both the basin and range kind of comes up into Oregon a little bit, and then we have the Cascades rising up. And so it can be really difficult as a paleontologist to really understand, is it the global climate change curve that we really should be watching, or is it these more local events that are causing the landscape to change and the mammals have to move, or we even have the Columbia River basalts too that erupted and covered the landscape. So we have a very dynamic landscape here in Oregon, and it can be a little difficult to go out and look at these patterns. But I think there is a connection between when the climate is warming and when the landscape is changing with those topography changes as well.
Thanks. Okay. So the second question kind of builds on this, and so we talked a little bit about the active and passive parts of North America. So the active region with the uplifts and tectonic activity, and the passive region, which is mostly quiescent today. And so the question is, do the active and passive regions harbor long-term areas of endemism as sources of species, or areas of extinction as sinks of species? So to explain, are there particular areas in active or passive regions that are like fountains that are producing new species welling up into the diversity landscape? And there are other areas maybe that serve as drains where species are going extinct, and so they're pulling in species and acting as a sink where the species are then disappearing. So like maybe not like a flow of diversity across the landscape. So what do you think about that? Are there areas of speciation, areas of extinction, or is it mixed up?
Let Becca start.
Okay.
Well, that too is a challenging question, but I will say at least from the perspective of the distribution of modern diversity across the landscape. So diversity comes in many different forms. You can have species richness, that's an obvious metric to look at diversity, but you can also look at diversity functionally, ecologically, phylogenetically. And so when you start pulling apart richness into these different dimensions, you can start to get at areas of high endemism. And so you do certainly for mammals see topographically complex areas light up when you look at it from the perspective of like phylogenetic endemism. So thinking about like the amount of evolutionary history that's represented and distribution of branch lengths between species, you see a lot, again, you see a lot of diversity in these other dimensions in topographically complex places. But what we don't necessarily have a great handle on is whether or not that is because that diversity is being generated in situ through speciation in these landscapes, or is it because it's accumulating there, or there's other processes potentially at work, like immigration into the system from elsewhere. That's a question that I think as a group we would love to answer. It's one we've been circling for some time, trying to figure out how are we going to get at that question of where is the diversity coming from. What else? I think Maya was going to answer that. Yeah.
Sure, so I would say, for the, you can have areas that do not have a lot of species, like here, for fish, but you can still have high speciation rates, which we can measure from the fossil record, and also using genetic data to understand speciation rates from the phylogenetic record. And so there's been some work that showed along the entire western margin of the Americas that although the species richness were poor in species, the speciation rates are high. And so what that implies is that there's a lot of extinction, and that many of the species that are created are no longer there. And so I think that could be one of the explanations. We see these differences in patterns of species richness between mammals and fishes because fishes are more sensitive to, I think, landscape change. They have to stay in their river or their lake, and it's harder for them to get out if the habitat changes. They can't just walk a long time, right? And so if a lava dams their lake and they can't get out, then that might lead to that population going extinct. And so there's some competing extinction and speciation compete to create the patterns of species richness that we showed in our slides.
I actually ask a question to the other panelists.
Yeah.
So, we just talked about extinction, and for the first question, you asked about how tectonics and climate are, in synergy to create diversity. But something that I've seen, here in the Oregon record is extinctions can also be happening at that same time because you have climate change that's dramatically restructuring the landscape. So I wonder, is that a pattern that you have seen? Well,
We have measured that in the fossil record for mammals, and I would have thought the same thing, that we would find. When we have these great disruptions to the landscape, I would have thought that both speciation and extinction were high. But the fossil record is telling us that speciation is much higher than extinction during those times. And which was, not an answer I was expecting, but it's always great to have a surprise, especially when it actually is well supported by the data. And to get also to, reflect on the question that you're posing about the areas of endemism. We can't easily answer that question as well as we would like with a mammal record, mainly because when we see this big pulse that you saw in the slides I presented, we don't yet know whether that pulse is, how much that pulse is from new species being formed in the mountainous regions and how much immigration. We would need massive sample sizes from many geographic areas, all the same from many different time periods in order to answer that question definitively. And I'm hoping that all of the people, the young people coming along in paleontology are going to increase those sample sizes so that maybe, in 10 or 20 years, we can actually return to that question and answer it definitively.
Nice, thanks, Catherine. That's an important point. Paleontology isn't done, and we can do a lot in the museum. We have huge collections, so many that we need a new space that's bigger than the space that we've got. But we still need to keep going out and collecting new fossils, filling in those gaps so that we can make new discoveries and understand these processes better. Yeah, thanks. Okay. The next question I have is something that kind of builds on that mid-elevation diversity piece that Becca was talking about. And so the question is, do ecosystems at different elevations experience different climate changes? And if so, how does that affect their resilience to human mediated change?
Yeah, so that's something that I've looked at a little bit across, again, the modern mountains of the Great Basin. We've been able to quantify how much climate has changed over the last century, and we find that climate has changed a lot at high elevation, much more so than it's changed at low elevation. But what really surprised us, and again, like a well-supported surprise, was that the mammal communities at high elevation have actually remained relatively stable over the last 100 years. And that you see much more turnover at low elevations. And so it doesn't really answer the question that you posed about resilience, but we think that one of the things that's going on is that human impacts at low elevation are much more intense. They've been much more intense. I mean, these mountain ranges were wildly overgrazed. There were like millions of head of sheep that were packed into these mountains, and we have, fragmentation, habitat destruction, we've got fires, we've got cheatgrass invasion, and all of these, exacerbate each other as factors. But those types of effects really haven't prepped all the way up to the top of these mountains yet. So they are concentrated at low elevation. So our hypothesis is that the mammals are responding much more directly to those types of human-mediated disturbance at low elevation. Now, in terms of resiliency, I would assume that if those effects were to creep all the way up the mountain, that those communities would also experience a rapid and dramatic amount of change. We just aren't there yet. We still have relative stability, even in the face of pretty rapid climate change at high elevation. How long that's going to last, though, into the future, I don't know. I feel like we're definitely going to cross some sort of threshold where we're going to start to pick up more and more change. And you can also sort of see it creeping up the elevationally up mountains over time in terms of community turnover. Anyone else?
I guess I like to think about some alternative things as well, in terms of range sizes and how organisms move about. It is harder to move between mountains. So it is something to think about, that as the landscape becomes more fragmented, we're basically turning the lowlands into isolated populations, sort of what the mountainous species are already living in. So we're impacting the lowland species to really be fragmented. Some of them are larger, some of them are smaller. So the larger animals actually need to move around a lot in order to mate with each other and have enough food. So if they can't do that, they will go extinct. And we've seen that with the megafaunal extinction, right? A lot of the larger animals are disappearing because we're taking over the landscape, basically. And smaller mammals seem to be doing a little bit better because they can live alongside us and not be as impacted. And so it is something that, like, as we look at species over these elevation gradients, we also have to think about the traits they have and how we are kind of impacting their landscape. And it was that going to limit the species based on the traits they have. And it's a big thing for conservation, kind of thinking about, okay, these species have big home ranges where they have diets of a particular type, or they have short generation times or long generation times. These are all things that do actually need to get wrapped into conservation efforts as well.
Right, nobody else wants to, Maya, you want to talk about fish and elevation? How they deal with it? Okay.
I think there's competing effects in fish too. I mean, one thing, right, is like water flows downhill, and so effects can accumulate in a river system, and that can present a lot of challenges for management. And so that's not necessarily a climate question, but then I think similar, you know, these headwaters can you have less of a buffer for changes because there's less water, and so they can be more sensitive as well. So I don't know, you know, what that equation comes out to, except that they're competing forces.
Right. Suppose that means it's different for each species, and each drainage even, and don't worry about the situation, yeah. Okay, well, we're right at the time I wanted to open the floor to questions from the audience. Do we have another microphone, or should I go out with the microphone?
We might be able to.
Yeah, you can shout the question up here and then I'll repeat it,
Yeah.
so that, yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm really interested to hear what you said about the relationship between mountains and species diversity. I'm wondering now about the difference between a mountain range that runs north and south and one that runs east and west. My intuitive sense is that there'd be more resilience in the north-south range and less in an east-west range. But if you do two topographies that are identical and vary only that orientation, what would you find?
And just so that everybody can hear, the question was, if you had an east-west mountain range and a north-south mountain range that were otherwise identical, which one would be more robust to changing environments? Yeah, would like to answer that.
Yeah. Well, we do have some natural experiments with that, as you point out, with the Alps and the Himalayas, which are more east-west mountain ranges compared to all the mountains that are running through North America and South America. And I think what we're finding there is that there's certainly in all those places, we're seeing changes up and down in elevation as climate change both warms and cools. But we are seeing that there are some severe barriers to species shifting southward in, say, in Europe and southern Asia when they hit these huge mountain barriers. But we don't find similar barriers in the Andes and the Rockies. And so I think what you're implying is inaccurate. Does anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, there's a study, and I can't remember who it's by, but it's looking at bird geographic range sizes. And so, when the ice was covering much of the northern hemisphere, everything had to move south. And in North America, that really wasn't much of a problem because the barriers are running more south, and you can just sort of skirt your way down. And we had habitats and species occurring nowhere near where they are today because of that altered temperature gradient. In Europe, that wasn't the case because you run into the Alps, right? And so if you look at the distribution of bird geographic range sizes, the small range sizes are relatively underrepresented in Europe, compared to in North America. And the thought is that perhaps those species just went extinct because they could not move past that barrier. And then you have the expansion after the ice retreats. And so you have a bunch of species that are dispersing, but typically species that have higher dispersal also have larger geographic range sizes, because dispersal is a trait that's really important to have this geographic range size. And so the ones that have an easy time dispersing as the ice was retreating are also the ones that are sort of predisposed to having a larger geographic range size. So that's mostly what you have now left in Northern Europe because of that east-west barrier.
Let's ask Maya, how might that affect the movement of species, say, up and down the Mississippi drainage?
I don't know. I don't know if I've thought about that too much. One thing we think about with rivers and mountains a lot is whether our rivers run parallel to the mountain range, or whether the major rivers cut across the mountain range. And one idea is that early on in mountain ranges, most rivers are running parallel to the mountain range, and it takes a long time for the rivers to figure it out and start running perpendicular to the mountain range. And so I wonder if there are some examples in the Andes of these longitudinal rivers that run parallel to the mountain range, kind of within the range. And so it would be interesting to look at how species have responded to environmental change along those north-south gradients, whereas most rivers in North American mountain ranges are perpendicular to the mountain range. So that's a great question.
Hanging Canyon would be an interesting place to look too.
Okay. Yeah, great.
Let's see, we probably have time for maybe 2 more questions. Okay.
Kevin, you mentioned that after a large tectonic event, that there was a much higher rate of speciation. Thinking here in Oregon, those mainly being volcanic events, do you think that there's just a large conservation bias after that period versus, prior to that, and how is that taken into consideration?
And so I think he's asking, like, if the volcano is producing a lot more sediment, we're capturing more fossils, that could affect our preservation, right?
Super question, and fortunately, we have thought of something like that ourselves. So we have a collaborator who has gone through many of the basins of the Basin and Range and looked at the amount of sediment accumulation at different time periods. We do see that there is a slight delay of 1 million years or so between some local tectonics that's activating or bringing one of these mountain ranges, or pulling apart the Nevada Plano into these smaller mountain ranges, and when the sediment starts to accumulate in the basin. And in looking, if by integrating the data about sediment accumulation, the tectonic, the different extension rates in different parts of the Basin and Range, and mammal diversity, we see that the mammal diversity is persistently responding to the climate change more than it is to the preservation rate. So because it did occur to us, are we just seeing some kind of a preservational signal here? And it looks like the answer to that is no, and which I'm glad to see, because it would be too simple and I would hate to have the question be over at that point, because there are so many other components to it, but that seems to be the answer. Very good question, but the answer seems to be no. It does have an effect, but it's not the entire story. Yes, please.
So another interesting part of that especially is pertinent to here in Oregon is because they're volcanic ashes, if they are volcanic ashes, you can date them too.
Yeah.
So you can really get an idea of how much time is encapsulated in one formation or within one rock group. And that can really help, because something that can happen is it's called time averaging. It's when you have a lot of time actually collected in one, say, like section of rock. And if you have a lot of fossils in that section, you're kind of wondering, okay, did these animals actually live together, or did they just happen to get preserved slowly through time? And it can be really helpful to have fast sedimentation rates, because you get that quick turnover in the sediment, and you know those animals are actually living together as opposed to they weren't living together.
Okay, yeah, we have one more question. Okay, who's the last hand? I don't see.
This gentleman here.
It's a different question. It's really sort of off topic a little bit, so I'll pass.
Okay. Oh, we got one more person, all right.
It's kind of specific, but this is a question for Maya. I'm really interested in this difference between fish and mammals, how they respond, or like how their rates of endemicism are different with the tectonic activity, and you kind of went into that in your answer. But I was just wondering, one thing I'm thinking about is Lake Victoria. I feel like it's like the poster child of like endemic fish. At least that's what I remember from like biology classes. And I know that's like a very active area in the East African drift system. I was wondering if you have any explanation, or if you could explain how these deviations happen with the trend.
That's a fantastic question, and you're absolutely right that the lakes and the African rift valleys are some of the most or the most species rich for freshwater fish, and they're kind of classical examples of radiation of fishes, and they're a really important system. So yeah, certainly this global pattern that I've kind of described does not do full justice to the complexity of the connections between tectonics and life. And so the tectonic processes that I talked about, when I pointed out the Andes and the Himalaya are all convergent margins, so plates slamming into each other. And so something that I am curious about is if there is a different, signature of convergent margins versus divergent margins, so margins where plates are actually rifting apart, which is what's happening in basin and range extension, and as well as in the African rift valleys. And so, maybe, and then another thing I would say is maybe if we had a different climate, we would have more, fish species in the Great Basin, but we don't have big lakes. And so that's another example of how climate and tectonics need to work together to produce the right conditions for speciation.
To maybe a theme that's related to your question is the fact that mountains also have very different shapes. And some are very conical, and others are, they rise up very steeply and have very large areas of high elevation. And so there have been studies of the shapes of mountain ranges, and there are three basic kinds. And one thing that we haven't done, and would be really interesting, would be to look at the patterns of species richness with elevation with these different shapes. And that could be done for mammals. We could certainly be looking at, the counterpart to that would be to look at lakes of different shapes and basins, of shapes and areas, to do this something similar and look at fish species richness in that way. So the questions we've answered have just opened a portal into the whole interesting world of landscape history and vertebrate diversity. And of course, there are all the invertebrates that would also be a fascinating dimension to this, because there are millions of more species of them than there are vertebrates. But even what we've started to see gives us a glimpse that the Earth's history seems to be very intimately related with the history of life, and we're also finding ways in which life organisms are affecting the landscape itself. So it's a wonderful subject to be working on.
I actually think that's a great sentence to wrap it all up. We reached our time today. We'll be here for just a few minutes afterwards if you want to come in and chat and say hi, but I want to remind you that the store is open. The exhibits are open until 8 o'clock tonight. We're going to have one more of these panels during fall term. So after summer, we'll do one more panel. So be on the lookout for that. And are there any other announcements you'd like me to have? No. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you being here.